Hello there! What is going on, everybody? I am talking about Star Trek Into the Unknown today, and while I have been covering this game with various things like battle reports or unboxings, I have not put down my thoughts on the game, and I think it's about time to do that. So without further ado, I am going to be bringing to you my full review of Star Trek Into the Unknown, asking the question, is it worth it? Is it good? Is it fun? Is this something that you should get into? I'm going to talk about the pros and the cons, and as you know, I do cover a lot of starship games, a lot of spaceship games, a lot of science fiction games, board games, miniatures games, and if you want to see more coverage along those lines, definitely stick around and click that subscribe button. Plus, we are still doing the 12 days of Life Day all through December, so make sure you're entered to win any of those awesome giveaways. You just have to be a subscriber and leave a comment on this or one of my videos. It's as simple as that. So let's just dive into Star Trek Into the Unknown, and I'll give you my thoughts. So you can't talk about Star Trek Into the Unknown without talking about the miniatures, which are definitely one of the first things you see when you look at the box. So I figured this is the perfect place to start. Now, this game has amazing pre-painted, pre-assembled miniatures that are ready to play straight out of the box, which is a definite plus for the game. It uses a peg system that allows you to add or remove pegs and adjust their elevation higher or lower. They also have a very interesting design on the both large and medium bases that have 3 separate places for pegs to go in, allowing for a lot of customization on how maybe you want to mount them. Maybe I want to mount this guy standard on the back, but maybe I want to have him flying farther forward, or any kind of permutation thereof. So although I think for the most part you people will mount them kind of the suggested way. The smaller base ships only have a single peg slot in the base, but the small ships still have tremendous design, especially in the case of the Defiant. Now, a lot of these miniatures have very, very, very small decals that have the nomenclature and the ship's names and titles on them already, with really, really nice paint jobs on these. I go more into the miniatures in the unboxings and some of my other videos, so I won't duplicate too much of that here. We do have some slightly less popular ships that maybe casual fans of the series might not recognize, like this Constellation class right here, which many fans of Jean-Luc Picard may have thought was the Stargazer, but this is actually a Constellation class ship, and its actually nomenclature is for the Hathaway, which is a ship that was in service during the time of the Dominion War, where this game's setting sort of takes place. But the star of the show is absolutely the Enterprise. Now, this game does take place largely during the timeline of Deep Space Nine, on or around Season 2, thereabouts. However, the Enterprise D was still in service at that point in time. And what's really amazing about this ship, in addition to just being a remarkable model, is the fact that the saucer does separate and can then be launched into its own medium base, and then can fly around, and it's pretty impressive how that can work. And of course, you'll be able to run these two kind of independent of each other and then rejoin them when you'd like to. They fit together really, really well. And so the models themselves are absolutely spectacular. The bases do not have cardboard, which initially was a little bit surprising to me, but they do have different slots where you can put tokens to indicate that you've fired weapons already, or maybe what system you're in, or if you have duplicates of the same ship, you can differentiate them that way. There's a lot of different uses for these, plus all of the different firing arcs are outlined on these. So at first I was trepidatious about the lack of cardboard, and I've come to play, after playing it multiple times, I realized that the lack of cardboard does not matter at all. And I say that because this is largely going to be compared to games like Star Wars X-Wing or Star Wars Armada, which they do have cardboard in the games, and there's definitely going to be some similarities, but The similarities aren't too deep, and I think there's definitely a conversation to be had about how close are they to those games. But the gameplay is very, very different, and of course there are some similarities in the fact that they're pre-painted miniatures and you're moving around on a map against another player. But the gameplay is so very, very different, especially leaning more towards narrative play, which is a very interesting thing. And the movement is also going to be different as well. Let's look at that. So movement is going to be using this movement tool here, and you will slide this into the ship side, just like so, with the center line corresponding to the center line on the tool. Now there is an elevated portion of this movement tool right here. So once you get it locked in, if you're going straight, for example, you then hold it down and you can take one of these movement tools and slide that under, and they are marked in inches, and however many inches you're going to move, you can then pick this up and then slide it forward along the tool, then moving your ship and locking it back in. You can turn either before or after you move, and so if you wanted to turn beforehand, you'll have a certain number of clicks depending on your ship's speed and alert status, and then maybe we'll go ahead and move our couple of inches for our movement and then go that way. It works all right. There are both 12 inches and there's a single 6-inch tool in the core set. So on the surface, it seems just fine. However, in play, sometimes it can be tricky, especially if you're trying to move 11 inches and there are tokens in the way. And there usually are a decent number of tokens on the board. Trying to somehow fit a 12-inch ruler under this, but not knocking tokens out of the way, can sometimes be a little cumbersome. So I'm glad that they gave us the shorter ruler, but that only works if you're going shorter distances. So there are a lot of times where I'm having to put a tool over a token a little bit, and so it leads to a lack of absolute precision, which usually isn't a very big deal for me, but I know it can be for some folks. So I think it helps if you understand that there's going to be some space turbulence and your ship might get bumped a little bit when doing moves, but we try to be, try to have fun when you're doing it. But that's definitely something about the movement tool that is like less than optimal. But so a lot of times, it's a lot easier if you're going straight first, because if you're going straight, you don't necessarily have to use this tool. You can always just line up the tool with the lines on the ship and then slide it forward that way as well. Now, ships are controlled with this Starship display board. This is got everything that you need to know your ship's capabilities, and different stations assigned here where you can assign officers. Now, there are tons of officers recognizable from the game. You've got Captain Jean-Luc Picard, you've got Worf, and then since this game does take place in Deep Space Nine, Worf kind of pulls double duty, as does Chief O'Brien, but you have almost the entire cast of Deep Space Nine. And now I do want to point out one amazing thing about this. These aren't photos, these aren't movie stills or TV stills. These are all amazing art pieces this is the backside, but it's really beautiful. So the art is a very, very big plus in this game. And there's a lot of really excellent thoughtfulness that goes into this. There's faction symbols. Kira can work with the Federation, but also with the Bajorans. And she has sway with both the Federation and a lot of sway with the Bajorans. That allows you to, there's cross-faction capabilities here. Of course, Worf, has sway with the Klingons. Sisko has sway with the Bajorans. And there's even people like Jadzia Dax who have sway with the Klingons and with the Ferengi, which just shows a tremendous amount of thoughtfulness. Like maybe, Quark owes her some latinum, and she's going to call in some debts if she needs to. Quark is actually one of those notable omissions who's not in this particular set. But in addition to all of those named characters, there also are generic officers, all with point values, and that go into building your crew, because this game isn't necessarily about just how many ships you bring, but how many officers you bring to crew those ships. You will usually not have a ship with officers at every station. So if you were to have, for example, Sisko as the captain and Worf at tactical, and you had maybe, Kira at helm, that may be all you actually have for a particular game. You can have a little more or a little less depending on where you allocate your officers. Yeah, but a lot of times you'll have only like between 5 and 8 for your whole fleet, and so it's you don't really have every single slot on every ship used up. Now these boards are a little bit large. They have a lot of interesting information. There's different alert statuses. You can change from green alert to up to different stages of that, to yellow alert and up to red alert, and you gain more weapons power. Although your engines, you're basically rerouting power from engines to weapons and shields, and making your sensors get a little bit better. When you're at lower alert status, and your movement gets a little bit better. So there's different opportunities during the game that you'll need to move around and get to places and to scan objects or anomalies, or to beam away teams down. And every station has so much rules text, and that is both one of the beauties of this game and also one of the the learning curves of this game. It becomes a little difficult to learn everything. And fortunately, there's a campaign that takes you through that step by step that is very incremental with all right, now we're just going to learn one new thing in this mission, and we're going to learn one new thing in the next mission. And so you also have a damage dial over here where ships can take damage, and you can only take so much damage. Once you go into a different color type, you stop taking damage. You have a crew dial here. This represents the enlisted folks, the non-officers, the crew that are the lifeblood of your ship, and they can also take damage, and you lose effectiveness as well. And a lot of hard printed information here on these boards. Now the boards are largely good quality with thick cardboard, but they do over time they get to be a little bit looser, and they're not necessarily my favorite thing to have in a tabletop miniatures game, but they certainly work, and there's a lot going on here. But initially, I think I was hoping that there would be cards instead of boards, and there are cards for some things, so it's always possible there could be a card version of this at some point. But the boards definitely work, and of course we're I'm going to be using these for all of the games that we play on the channel, But yes, this is the boards themselves aren't like my favorite thing, but they do have a lot of information on them. But they also take up a lot of table space, so it kind of limits how many ships I might theoretically be able to run and still have a place for all of my ships. So currently the max is 3 per fleet, because that's what's in the core set. But hopefully there'll be some bigger fleet options here pretty soon. The Dominion also has their share of officers, between generic officers and their recognizable characters that you will recognize from the series, like Wayun. He's Wayun 4 because there's lots of different clones of him. You have the female changeling and other named characters and generics as well. Now, gameplay is very back and forth. You're going to go back and forth taking priority actions, and to do one of those, you will have to exhaust an officer that's at an appropriate station. So if I wanted to fire weapons, for example, I would exhaust my Vigilant Security Chief at Tactical and use the action that's printed on that section. In this case, it's fire weapons. Some stations have multiple actions, so you can choose one. For example, Instruments has, so you can launch a probe or do a sensor lock. At the captain's chair, there's a lot of different things you can do. You can take a warp maneuver. You can go to warp. You can call alert by, when you want to go from green alert to yellow alert, like raising shields up a little higher. Or you can do a special action that only the Galaxy class here not every ship has, I should say, because the Constellation has it too, but this one's called Address, and this is a way to inspire units and give them some bonuses to their crew or tokens and things like that. So there are a lot of different things that you can do at these different stations. However, you'll keep going back and forth until some player passes, and then the other player passes. Once everybody has passed, you move on to the next phase. But you're only, at the end of the run, you're only going to be able to ready 3 officers across your entire fleet. So if you take all of your actions and you do all your moves and spend all your energy, and these officers have these different symbols because, for example, a warp maneuver wants this symbol, that symbol, and then an energy. And every symbol that the officer doesn't have you have to pay an extra energy for. So it could cost you up to 3 if you had an unqualified captain. But since Picard has those symbols in spades, it'll only cost us the 1 energy to go to war. And that's how most of these actions are. You want to assign officers to these different chairs, basically, or these different terminals that are qualified. So, having my security chief at tactical is a good thing. Plus, he's got keywords that allow him to roll extra dice when he does an attack. So there's a lot of thought that goes into this, and a lot of these characters have keywords. Like Worf, for example, is very good at tactical, and so there's a lot of thought that went into the different the officer cards, because they're really what makes everything work. There are 3 different parts to a game for a standard game. I mean, you can also play a story mission, which is all covered by the campaign guide. But as far as your basic gameplay, you're going to have a situation card, an overture card, and a complication card. Well, each player will have a complication, and the situation and the overture are the 2 cards that kind of set up the board, define the fleets, and tell you kind of what you're out here in space trying to do. So this will tell you a little bit about the type of the feature setup that you have. This one will tell you the sector setup, so how the map is going to look and what kind of fleets that you're going to bring, what kind of ships that each person will bring. And they've tried to keep these kind of open-ended because there's options for support ships, and other ships that aren't even out yet. So as you add to your collection, you can go back and play these missions again, over and over again. And these can be randomized, or you can agree on specific ones beforehand. And so this will also indicate how you want to set your first 3 cards. Now you have these 3 directives, and these are the Federation directives, and they talk about how you do hailing, how you form teams, and how you handle combat. In the case of the Federation, they like to usually start out in peace. But there's also, these can all be flipped based on different things that will happen, and these will change. Now we're at war, or now we can't hail you anymore, and things like that. So these, and every one of these, every faction is going to have at least 3 of these to be able to start the game with, which is pretty interesting. But they'll also be determined by your different overtures. For example, you might have an overture that has these 2 that are set to their orange side. You may have some that have them all set to their blue side, and these are going to change the game every time. And especially when you combine them, you're going to be getting various different types of gameplay. Now, there's also going to be a complication. Now, each player will bring out a complication, and they'll set them up like so. And when players are, doing missions or attacking, sometimes you'll get an analysis result, which the analysis result can be spent to pull this token maybe closer to my side. And then on a follow-up, I can get another one, and I can pull it even closer to my side. At the end of the 3rd round, wherever this influence marker is, that player's complication will get flipped over. And usually you're going into a game with something that's a little bit more agreeable for your play style or your fleet or your crew. So maybe if I'm playing the Federation, I went with something that's a little more peaceful, that has us working together. And this will also set those directives to blue. Whereas maybe my opponent had something that's a little more hostile and a little bit more setting everything to the orange side. So this way they were hoping to go into battle if we weren't already. It is also worth noting that this is a really cool system, because this also opens the game up to something like this, which is 3 players, which would play perfectly seamlessly in this format, where it can be pulled to this player over here. So now we're all fighting 3 ways, or beyond, or 4 players, 5 players, however many players you want. Of course, I don't know if I would not want to go more than 4, because it can take a little while when you're only readying 3 officers and having to think, because there's a lot of thinking that goes on with this game. It is very much about trying to know what is, what your opponent's planning and what the best move is. Now, the game is played on a 3x3 playmat. It's recommended for a 3x3, and you're going to have different systems. There's 3 different layouts for a system. There's a solitary, which will have one of these system markers kind of in the center, and you do a big ring around that. There's the helix, which is the current system that we have set up here, that has like a system over on this side and another system over on that side. And there's also a trinary version that has 3 systems, 2 in the corners and 1 on the side. And basically, The systems represent an entire solar system, and with different various objects that may be in them, or anomalies, or planets, or space stations. And you'll be doing warp maneuvers to enter or exit a system, and then impulse maneuvers for everything else, whether it's inside a system or just trying to get yourself, a different heading when you're in deep space, which is everything else. So the movement and the system setup does allow for a lot of gameplay, but doesn't necessarily take up too much table space. So that is definitely a plus, although you do have the ship boards, which take up a little bit of extra table space as well. Now, Star Trek Into the Unknown is not strictly a combat game, although it does have combat, and combat is a lot of fun. There's a lot more to this game than combat. As a matter of fact, you will not necessarily use combat in all of your games. You will have some games that have no combat at all, and sometimes that's exactly how you want to play it. For example, simply positioning. Maybe my opponent is trying to run a scan on this station here, and by me simply being close to it, I'm making it more difficult for him. There's also a hailing and diplomacy step that has this entire mini game where we exchange face down numbers that are called trust at the end of a round, and we see what if our opponent trusts us or if they don't trust us, and there's different benefits to those. So it's a very interesting mechanic that has potential rewards for both players, but slightly better rewards for the player that wins, and of course you can refuse hails, but that can also be an aggressive thing to refuse a hail, which can also lead to justification to enter combat. And one of the really interesting things about this is that a Jem'Hadar player can't just openly attack a Federation player, or a Federation player can't just openly attack a Jem'Hadar player. Well, they can, but they'll get negative victory points. You have victory points that are blue, and then you have orange ones that are negative victory points. You'll take a 2 victory point penalty if you attack somebody unprovoked. And so it kind of it gives you the freedom to do whatever you want, but also kind of guides you towards the thematic narrative focus of this game. Now, I did mention combat. Combat is basically used in using weapons power to assign to your different phasers, and different ships will have different types of weapons. For example, the Enterprise, while it is not a battleship, it does still have phasers, whereas the Defiant is it's a small ship. It is definitely the battleship and has 3 different weapons. It's got phaser emitters, it's got phaser cannon batteries, which are even better at a slightly closer range, and there's also quantum torpedoes. So the Defiant is definitely a warship. But in the case of the Enterprise here, for example, we'll roll blue dice, and they have the chance of having a single hit, a double hit, which is rare but awesome, or breakthrough successes, which can sometimes be used to deal a damage card to an enemy ship. And every type of ship has their own very small but very meaningful damage deck, which these will be you'll randomly be assigned 1 card from there. Very similar to how critical hits work in certain other games. But I also want to talk about torpedoes, because these are a very, very cool functionality and one of my favorite parts of combat in this game. So for me to fire a torpedo, of course, I'll have to have weapons power, and I have to have torpedo tubes sufficient to launch. But in short, I'm going to use the same maneuver tool, and I'm going to stick it in the front here and line it up perfectly straight. And I will have a little bit of maneuverability, and it'll be outlined on the card. For most ships, they can only turn it up to 1 notch from center, but in the case of the Jem'Hadar battlecruiser, they can turn theirs 2 notches from center, so they have kind of wider arrays. But most ships seem to only have a slightly narrow focus for torpedoes. And what will happen is I can launch these, and they will also move after ships have another chance to move at the end of each round. And if they ever get within 1 inch of an enemy ship, either before or after they move, they can detonate, and they roll some dice. They do a lot of damage, and they have the chance to do extra damage to ships once their shields are down. They can push hull. Normally, you can only damage a ship's hull until it changes colors 1 time, which usually hard caps at about 2 or 3 damage maximum per attack. But torpedoes can push past that 1 additional time, so they have a really excellent way to be able to cripple ships if done right. But they also serve as a way to kind of keep your enemies away from you, as opposed to getting too close. So if I'm maybe shooting at this Jem'Hadar battlecruiser, I might fire a torpedo over this way and set a fuse on it, and this will be how many turns it can move. I might put a tail on it right here. And then ships will be able to take a standby action at the end of our priority phase. Everybody can do one more action. Somebody might move out of the way, but this guy might be trying to come in. And if he comes in, he may get too close to that torpedo. So he might be incentivized to stay out. Now, torpedoes will move about 4 inches, and you're going to just move them along this line here. But they can also move a little bit on the other side of this, so they have just a little bit of movement, right? They have just a little bit of movement that they can do by flipping over on the other side of the range ruler. But if you have a sensor lock on your opponent, then they can move this way if there's somebody close by. So they have a little bit of more guidance if you have a sensor lock on the opponent. But even if you don't, even just moving them straight, can sometimes hit an enemy ship, especially if that ship is low on power and can't move. But it's also area denial, keeping somebody from trying to get very close to you and get close to because some of the phaser weapons are only 4 inches in range, or some are 6. And so you don't want people getting too close to you, especially if the posture of the game has people raising shields and powering up weapons. Another interesting thing is that a lot of missions will have these sort of randomized number tokens that will go down all over the board, and they correspond to various sort of legends that will outline what mysterious phenomena appears out in space. It could be something as simple as a mineable comet that can give you some good things if you decide you want to land an away team on there and try to harvest some resources off of it. Or it could be a pulsar that has an extreme gravitational pull that's going to start eating your ship away, depending on what they are. And you never know until you end up getting too close to them, and sometimes you can scan them preemptively to secretly look, although your opponent may not know. And one other thing is you don't necessarily want to fly at warp directly through those, because they could be a gravity rift that can damage your ship. It's very interesting stuff. But little details like that make every game even more unique. There are also a ton of extra cards representing shuttlecraft and different upgrades, and then the reference cards for torpedoes and different teams that you can create, whether they be engineering teams, security teams, or survey teams. They all have different things, and those come directly out of your crew. There's so much flexibility on like beaming people over, beaming teams, or beaming down to an object, because some of these can be like space stations, and these can be objectives for missions or represent a planet. And this kind of represents any type of solid object that you could beam an away team to. It could be the wreckage of a ship. It could be a Borg cube. It could be a planet, a moon, or something like Deep Space Nine, or a big space station, or a starbase, or something to that effect. So a lot of really interesting stuff. And when it comes to extra cards, I also think it's really cool to showcase how they have done the saucer section separation. So if you do have, your galaxy, and you separate the saucer section, it's no longer the same ship. It doesn't have all of the same resources, like those big phaser arrays, for example. So you have a card that kind of showcases what the star drive section has now that the galaxy class saucer section has disembarked, and then you have the saucer section kind of with its own stations, and can be flown completely independently, which is very cool, and I really like the way that they've done that. I think it's very elegant. And lastly, I do want to talk about the rules, because the game is very rules intensive, more so than a lot of other games that I've played. There's a lot of complexity, and the rule book has a lot of the rules answered in it, although there are certain things, especially when you're first learning, like the overview of a round, that's like in the middle of a book. And I feel like there's certain things I would have rather have been on the back or had reference cards for. Although I guess I'm hoping like on Board Game Geek or something like that, a lot of the community will kind of put quick reference cards and things like that together. But overall, the rulebook is very thorough, and it covers a lot of what you need to learn to play the game at your first time through. There's a lot of focus based on playing the first tutorial mission at Perdition's Gate, and that's a very basic scenario to play, and it's a good way to start learning the game. The only problem that I've had with it when I've kind of gone through this is that a lot of the things that you need for that mission are kind of at the end, like their complications are at the end of the book, and then you have to jump back, to this other part to like, okay, well, how did I do the influence track again? Okay, then just jump back here to this, and then look up the overview of a round, which is in the middle. So sometimes the flow of information can be a little confusing while you're still learning the game. You also have the campaign guide, which walks through how to run a campaign and has a lot of the different missions that you can do as you are running through that. But that's also one of my complaints, is that there's also an additional rules document that is not in here. It is available online, however, but for people who are like maybe kitchen table players may not want to reference an online rule book. Of course, I've gone ahead and like printed one out, so I've got that available. But for analog players that maybe don't have a tablet or a computer nearby, or don't want to have to read rules on their phone, it would have been nice to have that printed in here as well. But not a huge complaint, because those rules are currently available online. And if you don't have them, I guess, you could always probably skip over some of those things. There's certain keywords that are referenced that you need that for, that I suppose if you're just a kitchen table player, you could probably ignore, but it would have been nice to have that here. So that's my look at Star Trek Into the Unknown. This game is not what I initially thought it was going to be. I will confess that when I first heard the announcement and I first saw the miniatures, I was thinking, this looks like this could be Star Trek Armada. And as somebody who loves Star Wars Armada and always kind of felt like it was made to be a Star Trek game at heart, when I saw this, I thought my dreams had come true. I had found Star Trek Armada. It is not Star Trek Armada. It does have the ability to play like a war game where you can just say, I'm going in, I'm going to go guns blazing, and my opponent's going to have to deal with that or get shot down, and you can absolutely do that. But it offers so much more than that, and I feel like if you're playing it just as a combat game, and that's the only way you ever play it, you will miss out on so much more that they have done. It has all of these different mechanics and all of this theme that's really baked into it. The detail, the attention to detail is so exquisite that it gives you these scenes, these cinematic moments that remind you of a great moment from Star Trek, or your favorite series, whether it's Next Generation or Deep Space Nine or Voyager or original series, or even some of the newer series like Lower Decks, for example. But you have all of these triggers and these hooks and these things that can happen where maybe we've opened fire on each other, but we can still hail. And maybe I open up a hail with you and then I lose. And it was, well, who opened up the hail? Well, that was Worf. Well, Worf's not a good diplomat, and he ended up making things worse. And so all of these crazy things happen, and tell the story of your game as you're actually playing through the game. It reminds me so much of a game behind me, Star Wars Rebellion. Even though Star Trek Into the Unknown is not a Star Wars game, and it's definitely not a board game like Rebellion, it still has those deep hooks and integrated story elements that allow you to tell your own version of the story as you play the game. And that's a beautiful thing that I think you could miss out on if you're only playing for combat. Although, granted, it definitely works on that level. I think there's so much more that you can do with forming away teams and sending shuttles and escape pods, for example, like if your ship blows up. And it does play very, very well as a campaign. And some of the choices, mutual failures, and hey, we both need to succeed, or we're going to lose this officer, or we're each going to lose like our best officer from our fleets for the rest of the campaign. Give you that drive to kind of keep going, and that's a really interesting thing. That again, if you're only playing one-shot missions and only playing with a combat focus, you can miss out on a lot of what it has to offer. So while it didn't. It didn't completely replace Star Wars Armada for me. It doesn't have to, because it's doing something different. If anything, it kind of is poking in on Star Wars Rebellion's territory with the narrative aspect, which is also something I love about Rebellion. Also, another game with a higher learning curve. So hopefully I've given you a good thought of how I feel about Star Trek Into the Unknown. I am very excited about what is coming next for this game. The miniatures alone are worth the price of entry to me, but it may not be to you. So hopefully the gameplay was enough to get it across the finish line if you're thinking about picking up a copy of Star Trek Into the Unknown. Well, that's all I've got for today. I want to thank you all so much for watching, and big thanks to my patrons that help make this whole channel possible. I will talk to you later. May the Force be with you. Live long and prosper. Be excellent to each other. Party on, dudes. The spice must flow. And always wash your socks. See ya.